London, 1857. Rain lashed against the windows of Blackwood Manor with unrelenting fury, as if nature itself protested the scene unfolding in the oak-panelled study. Miss Eleanor Blackwood stood with Ramrod's straight posture before her father, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her face draining of colour not from fear but from pure, undiluted anger. Lord Blackwood, his own face haggard with worry, had just delivered the news that had shattered her carefully constructed world. The family was ruined, teetering on the edge of complete financial collapse, and her father had secured their salvation through the oldest of aristocratic traditions. She was to marry the Duke of Thornfield, a man whose reputation for cold arrogance preceded him like a bitter winter wind. Eleanor, at 26, was no simpering debutante. She was a woman of fierce intelligence who had secretly managed the family accounts for years, desperately trying to stem the tide of her father and brother's reckless spending. Her dreams of financial independence, of perhaps one day opening a school for girls where mathematics and science would stand equal with needlework and dancing, seemed to crumble before her eyes. "I would rather die than marry that cold, arrogant man," she declared, her voice trembling with emotion as she recalled the few occasions she had encountered the Duke at London balls and soirees. His dismissive gaze had swept over her, as if she were invisible, his conversation with other nobles laced with condescension, his entire bearing suggesting a man who viewed the world as his personal kingdom and its inhabitants as mere subjects to his will. Lord Blackwood slammed his hand upon the desk, making the crystal decanter jump. "You have been given a great honor, Eleanor," he said, his voice rising to match the storm outside. "The Duke could have chosen any young lady in London, yet he has agreed to save this family from ruin by offering for you." Her father ran a hand through his greying hair, looking suddenly old and defeated beneath his bluster. "You have 3 days until his arrival, 3 days to reconcile yourself to your duty as a daughter of this house." Eleanor felt the walls of the study closing in around her, the leather-bound books that had been her refuge now silent witnesses to her sentencing. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. To run away would mean certain poverty. To refuse would doom her family, including her younger sisters whose futures would be destroyed by scandal and penury. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with tension as father and daughter regarded each other across an unbridgeable divide of understanding. In this moment of crisis, Eleanor's independent spirit, the very quality that had kept the family afloat for so long through her clever management, now stood as the greatest obstacle to the salvation her father had arranged. She turned away, unable to bear the mixture of authority and pleading in her father's gaze, and stared out at the rain transformed into rivers down the glass, a perfect mirror to the tears she refused to let fall. The following day dawned clear and bright, as if the heavens themselves had exhausted their fury, but the storm within Eleanor raged unabated as she slipped from Blackwood Manor with determined steps. She sought refuge in the one place that had never failed to provide solace to her troubled mind, Pembroke and Sons bookshop on a quiet corner of Oxford Street. The modest establishment with its towering shelves and pleasant aroma of leather, paper and ink had been her sanctuary since childhood, when her late mother would bring her to select volumes that most parents would consider wildly inappropriate for a young girl. Now, as a woman grown, Eleanor moved with purpose toward the mathematics and natural philosophy section, her fingers trailing along spines of books that represented freedom in their bounded pages. Lost in contemplation of a particularly promising volume on advanced calculus, she failed to notice another patron approaching from the opposite direction until their bodies collided, sending her carefully selected stack tumbling to the floor in a cascade of leather and gilt. She dropped to her knees immediately, mortified by the disturbance in this hallowed, quiet space, only to find herself face to face with the most striking blue eyes she had ever encountered. The stranger knelt opposite her, already gathering her fallen treasures with careful hands that suggested respect for the written word. He paused, studying the title of one volume with undisguised interest rather than the dismissive confusion she typically encountered when men discovered her academic inclinations. "Lagrange and Euler in one afternoon," he remarked, his voice a pleasant baritone that somehow matched the warmth of the bookshop perfectly. That is either impressive dedication or a particularly effective cure for insomnia. The teasing light in his eyes removed any sting from the words, and Eleanor found herself responding with unexpected candor about her long-standing fascination with mathematical principles, her belief that numbers offered a clarity and certainty that human interactions sadly lacked. Rather than appearing bored or condescending, the stranger engaged her with genuine interest, challenging her assertions with thoughtful counter-arguments that revealed a formidable intellect of his own. Their conversation meandered from mathematics to natural science to the woefully inadequate education provided to women, during which the stranger expressed surprisingly progressive views on female intellectual capacity. When the bookshop owner cleared his throat pointedly, Eleanor realized with a start that they had been conversing for nearly an hour, still half kneeling in the narrow aisle. The stranger rose in one fluid motion and extended his hand to assist her, introducing himself simply as James, offering no family name or title to place him within the rigid hierarchy of London society. As she reluctantly prepared to return to the prison of her family home and impending doom, Eleanor realized this brief encounter had accomplished what she thought impossible, temporarily lifting the weight of despair from her shoulders and replacing it with the warm glow of intellectual connection. She bid James farewell with genuine regret, unaware that her chance encounter was anything but chance, or that the handsome stranger with the remarkable blue eyes and incisive mind was the very man whose name had filled her with such dread only yesterday. The next 2 days saw Eleanor and James meeting with such regularity that coincidence strained credibility, yet Eleanor welcomed each encounter with increasing warmth. Their first reunion occurred in Street, James Park, where morning mist still clung to the grass, and Eleanor had sought early solitude to clear her thoughts. She rounded a bend in the path to find James seated on a bench, sketching the outline of waterfowl on the lake. He rose at her approach, his face lighting with pleasure that mirrored her own unexpected delight. They walked the winding paths for hours, conversation flowing between them with remarkable ease, moving from literature to politics to philosophy without awkwardness or pretense. By their third meeting, in a sunlit corner of the public library, where dust motes danced in golden shafts of light between towering shelves, Eleanor found herself sharing confidences she had never revealed to another soul. As they sat with knees nearly touching in the intimate confines of a window alcove, she spoke of her passion for mathematics, her secret management of the family accounts, and ultimately, the crushing burden now placed upon her shoulders. "My father has arranged for me to marry a heartless duke who treats people as property," she confided, her voice barely above a whisper as she twisted her hands in her lap. "The Duke of Thornfield. I have observed him at social gatherings, so cold and arrogant, viewing everyone as beneath him. I am to be sold like livestock to save my family from ruin." James listened intently, his blue eyes focused entirely on her face, showing neither the dismissive condescension nor false sympathy she had come to expect from men when she expressed genuine distress. He seemed to choose his words with particular care when he finally responded, suggesting that perhaps not all is as it appears. Even dukes can be more than their titles suggest. "Some men," he continued, "are constrained by the expectations of their position, forced to maintain a certain facade that may not reflect their true nature." His gentle defense of a man he presumably had never met struck Eleanor as odd, yet deeply kind, revealing a generosity of spirit that only enhanced her growing regard. From the rain-soaked gardens where they huddled beneath his umbrella, laughing as wind whipped droplets into their faces, to the hushed warmth of the library where their fingers brushed while reaching for the same volume, causing heat to bloom across her cheeks, Eleanor found her emotional landscape shifting as dramatically as their settings. With each meeting, the specter of her impending marriage receded slightly, not because she believed she could escape it, but because James had given her the precious gift of being truly seen for the first time in her life. He debated with her as an intellectual equal, valued her opinions without qualification, and looked at her with an intensity that made her heart perform the most alarming acrobatics within her chest. As she reluctantly bid him farewell on the eve of the dreaded day, promising to meet once more after the Duke had arrived, Eleanor remained blissfully unaware of the truth that readers had surely guessed, that her James and the Duke of Thornfield were one and the same, and that the man she had come to admire had risked everything on this fragile connection formed without the weight of title and expectation. The dreaded day descended upon Blackwood Manor, casting long shadows despite the cheerful June sunshine that streamed through the drawing-room windows. Eleanor stood rigid beside the fireplace, her fingers gripping the mantelpiece with such force that her knuckles blanched white against her pale skin. She had dressed with deliberate simplicity in a gown of deep blue that her father had criticized as unbecoming for such an important introduction, but Eleanor had been determined to present herself without artifice before the man who would purchase her future with his title and fortune. The butler appeared at the doorway, his face a mask of practiced solemnity as he announced the arrival of His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield. Eleanor steeled herself, chin lifting in defiant preparation for her first encounter with the cold aristocrat she had dreaded for 3 days. The door swung open, and the world beneath her feet seemed to dissolve. Standing before her was not a stranger but James, his familiar figure now attired in impeccable formal clothing that emphasized his impressive height and broad shoulders in a way his simpler garments had not. Those same intense blue eyes now regarded her with apprehension rather than the warm admiration she had come to treasure. The blood drained from her face as comprehension dawned, transforming affection into betrayal in one devastating moment of clarity. Her father performed the introductions with obsequious enthusiasm, entirely unaware of the silent drama unfolding before him. Eleanor responded with mechanical courtesy, her voice sounding distant to her own ears as shock gave way to mounting anger. It was only when Lord Blackwood was called away to speak with the housekeeper about some detail of dinner that she found herself alone with the man she had known as James, now revealed as the Duke she had so vehemently rejected. "You deceived me," she accused, her voice trembling with hurt and fury. "Was it amusing to toy with the woman you are being forced to marry? Did you laugh about my confidences with your aristocratic friends?" The Duke took a step toward her, then stopped as she flinched away. "I never meant to cause you pain, Eleanor," he said, her name on his lips now seeming like another deception. "I only wanted to know you, truly know you, without the barrier of title and expectation." The drawing-room that had always been a place of comfort with its familiar furnishings and the scent of beeswax and lavender now felt like an elegant prison. The air between them vibrated with tension, thick with unspoken words and shattered trust. Eleanor felt herself suffocating under the weight of her feelings, the genuine connection she had formed with James now poisoned by the knowledge of his deception. Even as part of her mind acknowledged the logic behind his actions, her heart rebelled at being made the unwitting participant in such a scheme. She turned away from him toward the window, her rigid back communicating what her trembling voice could not, that something precious had been damaged, perhaps irreparably, by this revelation. The delicate foundation of mutual respect and growing affection they had built over their secret meetings now lay in ruins at her feet, creating a conflict that could not be resolved with simple explanations or apologies, for how could she ever trust that anything between them had been real? The formal dinner that evening was an exercise in thinly veiled hostility, carefully disguised as proper etiquette. The Blackwood dining room glowed with candlelight reflecting off the family's best silver, hastily polished for the occasion, while footmen in borrowed livery served courses with practiced precision. Eleanor sat opposite the Duke, her face a composed mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath, while his family members, including his formidable mother, the Dowager Duchess, and his younger brother, Lord Edmund, completed the intimate gathering. The conversation flowed with artificial pleasantness, until Eleanor deliberately steered it toward topics designed to provoke. She spoke eloquently about the inherent injustice of inherited privilege, the parasitic nature of aristocrats who lived off tenant labor while contributing nothing of value to society themselves, all delivered with such sweet smiles and perfect manners that her father could not openly rebuke her, though his complexion grew increasingly florid. The Duke answered each barb with measured restraint, his eyes never leaving her face even as she refused to meet his gaze directly. When the final course had been cleared and the ladies prepared to withdraw, Eleanor slipped away instead to the terrace, desperate for fresh air to cool her flushed cheeks and calm her racing heart. She had not expected him to follow, yet moments later she sensed his presence behind her, tall and imposing in the moonlight that cast harsh shadows across the stone balustrade. "You made your feelings about aristocracy remarkably clear this evening," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Eleanor whirled to face him, abandoning all pretense of civility as weeks of fear, anger, and hurt came pouring forth. She accused him of deception, manipulation, and using his wealth and status to purchase a wife who had no choice in the matter. Her voice rose with each accusation until she delivered the final blow, the words she had first hurled at her father, now directed at the man himself. "I would rather die than marry you, Your Grace," she declared, emphasizing his title with venomous disdain. The words hung between them in the night air, more final and cutting than she had intended. The Duke stood perfectly still, moonlight illuminating his face with silver light that emphasized the strong angles of his features and the unexpected vulnerability that transformed his expression. "I had hoped our conversations showed you the man beyond the title," he said quietly, his composure finally cracking to reveal genuine pain beneath. "I thought perhaps when we spoke of books and ideas, when you laughed at my poor attempts at humor, when you shared your dreams with me, that you were seeing James, not Thornfield." Instead of the cold anger she expected, his response held such raw honesty that Eleanor felt her certainty waver for the first time. The moonlight created stark contrasts across the terrace, deep shadows and brilliant illumination with no gentle middle ground, much like the emotional chasm that now separated them. He seemed about to say more, to bridge that impossible distance, when Lord Blackwood called from the drawing room, breaking the moment into irretrievable fragments. The Duke straightened, his aristocratic mask sliding back into place as he bowed formally and returned inside, leaving Eleanor alone with the uncomfortable realization that she might have glimpsed a truth she was not yet ready to acknowledge, that perhaps there was indeed a man worth knowing beneath the title she so despised. The next morning dawned with a peculiar atmosphere in Blackwood Manor, an undercurrent of excitement rippling through the household staff as Eleanor descended the main staircase. She had slept poorly, her dreams haunted by moonlit confrontations and wounded blue eyes, leaving her with a heaviness that made each step an effort. As she approached the breakfast room, she paused at the sound of urgent whispers coming from a side corridor, where two housemaids stood with heads close together, unaware of her presence. The words that drifted to her ears seemed impossible, fragments about the Duke renouncing his title, estates transferred to Lord Edmund, society in an uproar over the unprecedented scandal. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, heart racing as she strained to catch more details, certain she had misunderstood. The older maid mentioned a formal document signed yesterday morning, before the Duke had even arrived at Blackwood Manor, while the younger expressed shock that anyone would willingly surrender such wealth and position. Abandoning all pretense of propriety, Eleanor hurried back upstairs to her bedchamber, mind whirling with confusion, only to find a letter had been slipped beneath her door. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the same elegant script that had labeled a botanical drawing he had gifted her during one of their meetings in the park. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the pages, sinking onto the edge of her bed as the words transformed her understanding of everything that had transpired. James explained that he had made the irrevocable decision to renounce his title and estates to his younger brother days before their first meeting, weary of the emptiness of aristocratic life and longing for freedom to pursue scholarly interests without the burden of ducal responsibilities. He had arranged the marriage negotiations with her father, knowing he would no longer be a duke when the agreement was fulfilled, but hoping to provide the financial security her family needed through the generous settlement that accompanied his abdication. The reason for his deception became clear as she read further. He had wanted to meet her as himself, stripped of title and position, to discover whether they might build something genuine before revealing the dramatic change in his circumstances. His greatest fear, he wrote, had been that she would accept him for his title alone, never seeing the man beneath, but their conversations in the bookshop and park had given him hope that she might value him for his mind and character rather than his rank. The bedchamber that had been her sanctuary since childhood suddenly felt confining, the walls pressing inward as the foundations of everything she believed shifted beneath her. The man she had condemned as an entitled aristocrat had willingly surrendered privilege and power, while she, who prided herself on seeing beyond social conventions, had judged him by the very title he had already discarded. The bitter words she had hurled at him on the moonlit terrace returned to haunt her with new meaning, her declaration that she would rather die than marry him taking on a cruel irony when he had already given up the very thing she most despised about him. Eleanor strode into her father's study without knocking, a breach of etiquette that reflected her inner turmoil. Lord Blackwood looked up from his correspondence with a frown that quickly shifted to resignation as he recognized the determined set of his daughter's jaw and the letter clutched in her hand. "Is it true?" she demanded, dispensing with pleasantries entirely. "Did the Duke of Thornfield, or James as I now know him, come to you weeks ago with an arrangement that would save our family finances even without marriage?" Her father set down his pen with deliberate care, the slight tremor in his hand the only indication of his discomfort. "It is true," he acknowledged after a lengthy pause. "Mr. Vallemont, as he now styles himself, approached me with most unusual terms. He would provide a settlement generous enough to clear our debts and restore the estate to prosperity, with only one condition, that he might meet you as a common man before any formal arrangement was discussed." Lord Blackwood gestured to the chair opposite his desk, and Eleanor sank into it, her anger giving way to confusion. Her father explained that James had been remarkably forthright about his intentions, revealing that he had already begun the legal process of transferring his title and principal holdings to his younger brother before initiating negotiations with the Blackwoods. He had grown weary of the artifice of aristocratic life, the emptiness of relationships built on advantage rather than genuine connection. Above all, he had wanted the freedom to pursue scholarly interests in natural philosophy and mathematics that had been deemed inappropriate for a duke, but might be respectable for a private gentleman of means. "And he wished to meet you, Eleanor, without the shadow of title and wealth coloring your perception of him," Lord Blackwood continued, looking at his daughter with new understanding. "He spoke of you with remarkable insight, describing your intelligence and independent spirit as qualities to be treasured rather than managed. I confess I was skeptical, but his sincerity was difficult to doubt." Eleanor listened in growing wonderment as her father revealed that James had taken a modest house near the British Museum, where he intended to establish a small laboratory for scientific experimentation, maintaining only enough wealth from his former estates to live comfortably and fund his research. The settlement he had arranged for the Blackwoods was substantial, but would not impoverish him, representing a carefully calculated balance that would allow both parties to move forward with dignity. Sunlight suddenly broke through the clouds outside, sending a shaft of golden illumination across the study that had seemed so threatening just days before. In this new light, the room felt transformed into a place of revelation rather than confinement, much as her understanding of James had been transformed by the truth of his sacrifice. The magnitude of what he had surrendered became increasingly clear, not merely wealth and position, but the very identity that had shaped his existence since birth. And most remarkably, he had done so before meeting her, not as a desperate gesture to win her approval, but as a genuine act of self-determination that reflected his true character and principles. The romantic conflict deepened not through new obstacles, but through Eleanor's dawning recognition that she had judged him by the very standards she claimed to reject. Seeing only the title rather than the man who had found the courage to redefine himself according to his own values rather than society's expectations. Eleanor rose with the dawn, following a night of profound introspection, dressing herself in her simplest morning gown of dove grey, with no adornments save a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother. She left a note for her bewildered lady's maid, slipped from the house like a thief, and hailed a hackney cab on the main road with a confidence born of desperation. The address she gave the driver led them through increasingly intellectual quarters of London, until they reached a modest brick townhouse near the British Museum, its exterior distinguished only by window boxes filled with carefully tended herbs rather than decorative blooms. For long minutes after paying the driver, Eleanor stood on the pavement, gathering courage before finally mounting the steps and lifting the brass knocker. The housekeeper who admitted her seemed momentarily startled by the arrival of an unaccompanied lady, but directed her to the study at the rear of the house when Eleanor identified herself. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before her with new eyes. James sat at a desk positioned to capture optimal light from the large windows, surrounded by stacks of books and papers covered in mathematical notations. Various scientific instruments occupied every available surface, while shelves overflowed with volumes arranged by subject rather than for aesthetic display. It was a room designed for work and thought rather than impression, much like the man himself, who looked up at her soft footfall with an expression of such naked surprise that Eleanor felt her carefully rehearsed speech desert her entirely. She stepped into the room, removing her gloves with deliberate care to disguise the trembling of her fingers. In the clear morning light streaming through uncurtained windows, she truly saw him for the first time, not as the Duke she had feared, nor even as the idealized James of their early meetings, but as himself, a man of principle and courage who had risked everything for authenticity. "I rejected a title, not a man," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I fear I have been as prejudiced as those I criticized, judging you by the very standard I claim to despise." The modest study, with its simple but quality furnishings, reflected James's true nature, unpretentious yet dignified, practical but refined. Books were arranged by subject and frequency of use, rather than for display, scientific instruments positioned for function rather than ornament, everything speaking of a mind that valued substance over appearance. Eleanor's acknowledgement of her own prejudice marked her growth beyond righteous indignation to genuine self-awareness, her willingness to stand vulnerable before him demonstrating courage equal to his own. James rose slowly from his desk, hope and wariness battling in his expression as he moved toward her with measured steps that betrayed his uncertainty. The distance between them represented more than physical space. It was the final barrier of misunderstanding that had separated two people who, despite social convention and mutual misconception, had recognized in each other the rare possibility of true partnership. James moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the small garden beyond, gathering his thoughts before turning to face Eleanor with newfound resolve. "All my life I have struggled against the constraints of my title and position," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "As a boy I longed to explore, to experiment, to pursue knowledge for its own sake, but was constantly reminded that such pursuits were beneath the dignity of a future duke. Mathematics, natural philosophy, astronomy, these were acceptable as casual interests, but never as serious endeavors for a man of my station. My father viewed my scholarly inclinations as a disappointment, my tutors as a distraction to be overcome. Society expected me to manage estates, make advantageous connections, and eventually select a suitable bride to continue the lineage." His expression softened as his eyes met hers. "I gave up nothing of value when I surrendered the dukedom. I gained the freedom to pursue what matters, knowledge, purpose, and perhaps the heart of a woman who sees me, not my position." The simplicity and sincerity of his declaration stripped away the last of Eleanor's defenses. In that moment she recognized that she had found something far rarer than the freedom from unwanted marriage she had initially sought. She had found a true equal, someone who valued her mind and spirit, rather than viewing her intelligence as an inconvenient trait to be tolerated or suppressed. She stepped toward him, closing the physical distance that mirrored the emotional barriers they had constructed through misunderstanding. As they continued to speak, sharing their genuine hopes and fears without pretense or calculation, the room grew warmer with afternoon light that seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the clarity growing between them. James described his vision for research unfettered by aristocratic expectations, while Eleanor confessed her long-standing dream of establishing an academy where girls might receive the mathematical education she had struggled to obtain through solitary study. Their words overlapped with increasing excitement as they recognized the alignment of their values and aspirations, their shared belief that knowledge should be pursued for its own sake rather than for advantage or display. The conversation flowed with the ease of true compatibility, touching on practical concerns of family obligations and societal reactions, but always returning to the core truth that had emerged from their tumultuous beginning, that they had discovered in each other the rare possibility of partnership based on authentic connection rather than convention. This emotional resolution completed both their character arcs, James finding the courage to live according to his own values rather than inherited expectations, and Eleanor moving beyond righteous indignation to recognize that true independence meant judging each person as an individual rather than a representative of their class. As the afternoon light bathed them in golden warmth, the distance that had seemed insurmountable on the moonlit terrace dissolved completely, replaced by the profound understanding that they had each, in their own way, been fighting the same battle all along. 1 year later, the modest but beautiful townhouse near the British Museum had been transformed into a home and intellectual haven that perfectly reflected its occupants. Bookshelves lined every available wall, filled with volumes on mathematics, natural philosophy, literature, and history, while large windows allowed natural light to flood the main rooms where James and Eleanor conducted their work. The morning room had been converted into a publishing office where they managed their scholarly venture, Blackwood and Valemont Academic Press, which specialized in scientific and mathematical works, including several by women authors who had previously struggled to find publishers willing to consider their manuscripts. Eleanor stood by the window, proudly holding the first printed copy of her mathematical treatise on differential equations, published under her own name without pseudonym or apology. James watched her from his desk, his face alight with the mixture of pride and admiration that had characterized their first year of marriage. Their unconventional path had not been without challenges, from the initial scandal that rocked London society to the painful estrangement from Eleanor's father that had only recently begun to heal. Yet, they had built something remarkable together, a partnership of equals that had flourished away from the stifling constraints of aristocratic expectation. The doorbell chimed, announcing the arrival of James's brother Edmund, now the Duke of Thornfield, who visited regularly despite the continued whispers his association with the fallen Duke occasionally provoked. As they settled in the comfortable sitting room with tea, Edmund shared the latest news from London with barely suppressed amusement. "Society still gossips incessantly about the Duke who surrendered everything for love," he reported, adding that several romantic ballads had been penned about the scandal, each more melodramatic than the last. The newest variation suggested that James had been bewitched by Eleanor, a narrative that made them both laugh given the rational foundation of their connection. Edmund continued with news of their mother, who had finally ceased her campaign to have James reclaim his title and had even, reluctantly, begun to acknowledge the success of their publishing venture. As afternoon sunshine spilled through the windows, bathing the room in golden light that highlighted the contentment on their faces, Eleanor took James's hand in her own. "They will never understand that you gained everything by giving up a title." "And so did I," she said softly. James squeezed her fingers in silent agreement as Edmund watched the exchange with growing comprehension of what his brother had discovered, something far more valuable than the dukedom he had inherited. As the three continued their conversation, moving easily between family matters and scholarly discussions, the scene remained illuminated by that perfect golden light, symbolic of the brightness of their unconventional but ideal future together. Their story had come full circle from confrontation to understanding, from rejection to acceptance, from prejudice to wisdom. In choosing authentic love over social position, they had not surrendered anything of true value, but had instead gained everything that mattered, a life built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine connection that no title or fortune could have provided.